Welcome to the second video in Beetlegust. If you're new, Beetlegust is where I make Beetlejuice themed miniatures all August long. Last week I made the Smoking Man, and if you saw the thumbnail, I'm sure you realized that this week I'm making the Chicken Man and the Shrunken Head Man. I actually have quite a bit to do because it's two dolls that are fully dressed, so let's get started. In last week's video, I went ahead and divided up all the things I was going to need for each doll into baggies. So today I'm pulling out the Chicken Man bag to get started. This has all the doll parts, which are porcelain, and all the fabric that I think it's going to take to create his outfit. The head I'm using for the Chicken Man is actually the same head I used for Uncle Fester in my Addams Family project. However, today I am going to sculpt on top of it to make it just a little bit different. I realized that this kit had the bare feet in it, and I wanted to switch those out with the heart surgery patient because he's going to be in heart surgery. So it makes more sense for him to have bare feet, and then it makes sense for the Chicken Man to have the more shoe-shaped feet because I am going to have to put shoes on him, so I switched those two. I also realized he is going to need to be very red because that is the color he is. You'll notice that probably none of my kits are going to stay the same skin tone that they are once I receive them. They're all going to be changed just a little bit. I wanted to see if using chalk pastel was going to be a good way to do this. I still wanted it to look like a skin tone underneath the color, but have the color kind of brushed on top. Shaving the chalk pastel first before I applied it worked really well and gave me a lot more color than just trying to brush it off the pastel stick. So I decided to go ahead and shave quite a bit and put it into a storage container for later. Now, the Chicken Man presumably died because he got a bone stuck in his throat, which you can see in the movie, pretty pronounced in his throat. So I'm going to be using one of my dollar store skeletons to help me with that again today. But first, I need to put the body together. I was taught that traditional dollhouse bodies go together with pipe cleaners. Now, this is maybe not the way you would normally do it because I'm pretty sure he's not supposed to have a neck, but I do need him to have a neck so that I can put the bone into it. So I'm going to be adding the pipe cleaner sticking up just a little bit, and then I'm going to glue it into both the head and the body so that it stays still. This is going to help me place the bone and then sculpt around it. I used tacky glue initially to get the neck where I wanted it, and then I went back and added a little gel super glue right at the base of the neck to make sure that it all froze in place. Now that it's ready, I can go ahead and start working with the bone. It's obviously way too long because it's the size of a human bone, and so I'm going to cut it down, and arguably it's still a little bit too big once I have shrunk it down, but I think I want it to be pretty noticeable because he is going to be pretty far back in the diorama, and I just don't want there to be any chance that anyone won't see that he does have a bone in his neck. I'm using some super glue to glue it in place, and while that's drying, I can go ahead and work on his arms. A good way to figure out how long arms need to be is to make them equal to the height of your character. So I was kind of tracing his body length with the pipe cleaner, and then I straightened it out to put his arms on. Then I could figure out how much I needed to cut off the ends so that the hands were at the correct length. This looks about right, and so I'm happy to move on with the legs. I'm going to be twirling a pipe cleaner to make sure that this is extra strong, and then sticking it through the bottom of his ceramic body, and then pulling them forward because the legs are going to be sitting forward while he's in the chair. I'm probably not going to go into as much detail on how to put doll bodies together in the future videos in Beetlegust, but I wanted to show it on this one, and so that's why this character is going to take a little bit longer because I'm showing you how I'm putting him together, but it's pretty much the same for each one. You're going to add pipe cleaners and then add the ceramic parts onto the body. For the legs, I felt like they were a little bit too skinny, or the pipe cleaners were a little bit too skinny to fill up the leg cavities before I glued them on, so I just decided to wrap the legs with a little bit of fabric, and this is going to make it easier once I decide to add the legs. While that was drying, I decided to go ahead and work with some epoxy sculpt to sculpt the neck and a bit of the face. Epoxy sculpt is two-part material that you mix together, and you have about an hour or so to work with it until it starts to harden, and once it hardens, it is rock hard. I figured this would be a great thing to use when I'm working with porcelain. I need to make it seem as though the bone is actually inside of his neck, so I'm sculpting the epoxy sculpt around the bone and trying to smooth it into his body and into the bottom of his face. I'm doing the same thing on the back of the neck, and this is going to cover up the pipe cleaner that I used to put his body together and just make everything look cohesive. This is when I realized the bone was probably just a little bit too big and stuck out a little bit too far, but I'm going with it, and I don't think being over exaggerated is going to be something too bad in a Beetlejuice project. I also decided to add a bit of bulk to his cheeks and his chin, and I felt like adding some width to his face would help offset the wideness of the bone in his neck. Back to the legs, I decided to go ahead and put him into the chair to make sure I was gluing them in the right spot. This means he has some extra long legs, but I do feel like he sits better in the chair when the legs are not completely next to the body. This is how he's sitting at the moment, and so I decided to also pad up his rear end so he sat up a little bit more. I'm going to cover the pipe cleaners with a bit of a cotton ball swab, and this is to make sure that when I put the clothes on, it doesn't look like he's missing some of his body because the clothes are sitting too closely to the pipe cleaner. This is how he's looking once the cotton swab is put onto his body. You can also use glue to push these pieces down, but I find once the clothes are on, they stay in place. Before starting his clothes, I knew it would be easier to work on his shoes, but before doing the shoes, I need to make the leather for the shoes. This is how I've made leather in the past: miniature faux leather, real leather, or even real or fake real size leather, I'm not quite sure how to say that, is too thick for miniature projects typically. So what I like to do is make my own. I use a piece of fabric, I paint whatever color leather I want on top of it, and then I use Mod Podge to go over and allow that to dry. This gives it a nice leathery sheen and a nice leathery feel. Now I did post this on Instagram and people thought it was duct tape. The reason for this is because you can still see the fabric weave through the Mod Podge. Now, one thing you can do if you want a really smooth leather is to sand it in between Mod Podge applications. This is a really nice thing about Mod Podge, is that you can do as many layers as you want. So I only did a couple layers with sanding in between, and from a distance, I think it still gives an adequate leather appearance. Because I had added the epoxy sculpt to the face of the character, I needed to paint over it, so I had a consistent base for all of the skin. I ended up mixing a color that was way too light for the body, so I decided to paint any part of the skin that's going to be seen so that it was all very similar. I also needed to sand it down because when you use acrylic paint, it does leave little tiny brush strokes in the paint, which is not usually a big deal, but when you're working in miniature and little tiny faces, you can see them. If you didn't know this, paper towels can be a really light sandpaper, and it worked really well to get rid of most of the brush strokes. I did this in between each coat so I could hopefully keep my acrylic paint as smooth as possible. Once the paint had completely dried, I wanted to test to see if the chalk pastel was going to work the same on the paint as it did on the ceramic body. Unfortunately, it did not, and I was pretty devastated because I really liked how it looked on the ceramic. The chalk pastel on the paint ended up looking very blotchy, and you could see every little tiny imperfection in my paint work. I decided to try and add some water to the chalk pastel to see if it would go on a little bit more smoothly. Initially, I thought this was working, however, I do think it was still way more blotchy than it would have been if I hadn't had to paint it with acrylic paint. I also ended up getting these really weird bumps that were on the hands, which I think gave some interesting skin texture. However, I'm not going to want this effect on all my dolls, so thankfully it did go away after a while. After everything had dried, I decided to add a layer of Mr. Super Clear, which is a sealant and also gives a great base for the next layer of whatever you put on. Then I used a dry brush to add more chalk pastel on top, and I felt like I got a much more even coverage. So a couple layers of this worked out really well. However, he is still kind of blotchy, but I think that's okay. It really doesn't make him look one color, which I think is more accurate. If they were trying to make him look as though the color came from him choking, I think there would be quite a few different colors going on in the skin. I'm now adding a few more colors into the areas which need to be a bit darker. He does have some dark circles around his eyes. And then I also use this to accentuate the bone in his neck by adding some dark color around to make shadows and make that area really pop out. This is how it's looking after I've applied all of my chalk pastel. Now it's time to work on the shoes. I'm really sorry for the pose this guy is in. There's no way this is not going to be a little bit awkward. I'm starting these shoes the way I usually do, which is wrapping a piece of fabric around the back of the foot. Then I'm going to try and figure out where I want the top of the shoe to be and mark that off with a pencil. This is going to be the top line of the fabric, and then I can start shaping it from there. Once I have it the height that I like, I can go ahead and glue it to the back of the foot and let that dry. Each shoe is going to be a little bit different according to how it needs to look, but then I typically glue the sides on and then add a little bit of glue to the top of the foot and just fold the top pieces over to create a sort of V shape. Once that's done, I can push it down over the top of the toe and start to trim off any of the excess that overlaps the foot. This is a basic start to most shoes that I make. Then I can add a tongue that's going to go up the front of the foot. And as you can see, I previously just painted socks on to make it a little bit easier. I'm adding a strap over the top of the foot to hide the bottom of the tongue. I'm going to cut that off and glue it on. And then after that, I can add the soles of the shoes, which are the same exact material. I'm just going to glue those on and then carefully trim them once they're dry. To hide the raw edge of the soles, I'm just going to make a very, very thin strip of the faux leather, put that around the edge of the shoes, and then the final step was to just make some fringe by cutting into a rectangle and then gluing that on top. The chicken man is going to need a suit. I've actually made quite a few suits and I have quite a few videos over those suits. So if you're looking for a really detailed video to show you how to make one yourself, I'm going to put the links to those videos in the description box below so you can check them out. For this video, since I'm trying to cram 2 characters into one, I'm just going to be doing an overview of how these clothes are going together. And the Shrunken headman is pretty much the same, except instead of a suit, it's just a shirt. It's basically like make a tube and put it on the arm, make another tube and put it on the other arm, make a tube for the leg, a leg-sized tube, and then put it on the leg. So those are the basic steps, and then another tube for the other leg. To start making the first tube, I'm just going to be tracing a pattern that I've been using since the Addams family, and this is going to go on some brown fabric that I thought would be good for the suit. I'm using my clover iron, which I will also put in the description because it's just so helpful when it comes to creating miniature clothing. It really helps with getting the patterns to lay the way you want them to. And if you prefer to use glue for your seams like I do instead of sewing, it cures tacky glue almost immediately, which is really helpful to get these clothes made rather quickly. I'm going to be putting the pants on one leg at a time. This is really helpful because the legs are bent. If his legs were straight, it would be easier to put the pants together and then put them on, but the bent legs just makes it almost impossible to get the pants on the way they need to be. The back doesn't look the greatest, but you're not going to be seeing the back, so I'm not worrying about it too much. For the shirt, I'm just going to be doing a very simple shirt because mostly it's going to be covered up by a chicken bib anyway. I'm trying to make sure it's short so that you can see a little bit of his pants belly showing, because you can see that in the movie and I just think it's kind of cute. He has a little round belly. So I want to make sure that the shirt and the chicken bib don't end up covering that up. I'm using the iron to hem the shirt, and then I'm also using the iron to cure the glue as the shirt goes onto the body. While I'm working on this, I'm making sure to see what parts of the outfit we actually are going to see and focus on making those. You are going to be able to see a little bit of the collar, so I'm making sure to add the collar. This also hides the raw edge of the shirt. Now I can move on to making the jacket. The same that I did with the pants, I'm going to be doing with the jacket, which is putting the sleeves on one at a time. This is going to make it a little bit easier for me to adjust them and make sure that they're sitting correctly on my doll. Again, if you want more information on hemming or specifically how to use the patterns, be sure to check out those videos I linked below. They're going to be really helpful for you. Once the arms are on the way that I like them, I can move on to the vest part of the jacket. This jacket's going to be fairly simple. I'm not going to be worrying about any buttons or any specific details because the main focus of his outfit is the chicken bib. I do need to make sure that the vest stays open enough so that the bib can show through in the center. I like how it fits, so the last thing I need to do before I actually glue it onto his body is add the little collar detail that's going to go around the upper part, and that's going to again cover up the raw edge. Once in place, I'm going to use my iron and a little bit of glue underneath the jacket to freeze it in place so that it stays on his body. Now I can move on to the real important part of his outfit, which is his chicken bib, which is what makes him the chicken man, in my opinion. I used some printable fabric that I used in a previous video, I will link that down below as well, and just printed off some chickens that I found. I actually found like a coloring book chicken, and then I just colored in on my computer the colors that matched in the movie. Then I removed the backing and used some Mod Podge to go over the front and the back of the piece of material. This is going to help preserve the ink, make sure that if for some reason some liquid gets on this doll, that the ink does not run, and it's also going to give it more of a plasticky look, which I do believe the bib is supposed to be somewhat plastic in the movie. I'm using a hot glue gun to force some folds into the bib because this does need to look like it's coming out of his shirt. Using tweezers is going to help me fold over that top bit to give the illusion that the bib is folded over and going into the shirt. Once I'm happy with it, I can use a little dab of hot glue to glue it in place. I'm also double checking to make sure that the bib isn't interfering with the jacket, and that if I need to, I can pick up parts of the jacket and kind of play with them to make sure it looks a little bit more natural. Once I'm happy with the placement, I can go ahead and permanently glue it on, and now he is the chicken man, for sure, undeniably. But at the moment, he has no eyes, so I need to fix that. I'm going to be using some acrylic paint to paint over the areas of the sculpt that are supposed to be his eyes. Then I'm going to be using a little bit of black paint to give him some dark eyebrows. I am going to be using some viscose for his hair and just painting his eyebrows. I've never tried to give anyone real eyebrows or eyelashes before. They're too tiny. I am going to be painting in where the hair goes. This just helps once I start applying the hair, that if there are any gaps that you don't see too much skin showing through. Now I can add his irises. I want them looking down a little bit because I do plan to have him holding a magazine, so his hand pose makes a little bit more sense. He looks a little bit scared here, so I went back and decided to add some eyelids for him, and this helped tone down his expression just a little bit, and now he looks a little bit more calm like he does in the movie. Before applying hair, I like to give them a little bit of protection because I just put all of that work into the clothing. So if I drip glue or just get hair everywhere, this just kind of helps save my work. I'm using some black viscose for his hair. This is the same material I used for all of the Addams Family members, and it just keeps going. I bought it once and I just seem to never run out. I still have a huge amount. It's very, very fine, which makes really great 1/12 scale doll hair, but that means it gets everywhere. I'm starting with the sideburns. I cut off a very blunt end of one of the viscose strips and added some tacky glue to the side of the head. I'm just going to push the hair into the glue and then allow that to dry. Once it's tacked up, I can cut off the end because this is going to be my other sideburn. I'm going to add that to the other side, and then I can use a wider piece of viscose to create his back hairline that goes across his neck. I'm going to allow this all to dry and take hold for a little bit before I mess with it anymore. Once it's dry, I can cut off any excess, and I'm going to start gluing pieces down so that it forms along the shape of his head. When I'm working with a doll that has to have hair really close to their head, I like to use a mixture of water and tacky glue. This works like a miniature hair gel that helps all those little wispy bits lay down flat to the head. Next, I'm going to be adding a little bit of a comb over detail, and this is just by adding a bit of hair that's glued down and then flipping it in the opposite direction, which creates a part. Then I'm laying it down with my water glue mixture so that it is tight against the other side of the head. And this is how it looks. He just has a little part on one side, which I'm sure no one will ever see, but I know that it's there. I've almost completed everything on my chicken guy list except for a magazine. I had a magazine that I had in my collection and I put it into the waiting room previously. However, it wasn't a magazine that actually opened. I ripped it open so you can see the process of that there on the inside, and then I found a food-related magazine interior that I printed off. I printed a few different sizes to see which one would work best, and I liked the top page, so I'm going to cover that with Mod Podge and then cut it out. Then I can add it into my magazine. I thought it was only fitting that this foodie would be reading a food magazine in the afterlife, so I'm really enjoying that little detail. Once I was ready to put it into his hands, I realized he wouldn't hold it very well. His arms kept popping a little bit wider, and then the magazine would fall out. So since I know he's going to be in a permanent position, I didn't feel very bad. I felt kind of bad about adding glue to his jacket that I tried so hard to keep glue off of this entire time, but now his hands will stay at his side so he can hold his magazine in the waiting room. The Chicken Man is finished! Yay! Let's move on to the Shrunken Headman. Moving on to one of the most iconic characters in the Beetlejuice waiting room, we are going to be working on the Shrunken Headman. This one's going to be pretty unique because I don't have a head to go with this doll. I'm going to have to sculpt it myself. I do have a gun that was previously in my collection, and I also have the sofa so I can make sure that he sits on it correctly. I also don't really have a torso, so I'm going to have to create the torso from some aluminum foil. He has a pretty unique shape. He's kind of a trapezoid. Is that the right term? So I'm hoping to get most of his form figured out with foil, and then I can add the rest with cloth and the pre-made doll parts. I'm using some bamboo skewers to go through the torso that I created to make holes for the arms. I'm still going to be using pipe cleaners, except I'm just going to be putting it through the aluminum foil this time. And quickly, I just want to say sorry for my voice. I feel like I'm starting to lose it, but hopefully we can make it through the rest of this video. Here's how the arms are looking, and I'm just putting them in for now to try and get a feel for the size of this character. His proportions are a little off, so I'm not worrying about it too much. I did decide I needed to make a rear end with legs that are sticking out forward so that I can connect the pre-cast legs. I'm going to be twisting these so that they're a little bit stronger and then skewering the two body parts together, and then use some hot glue in between so that the two pieces are permanently connected. This is a great way to start creating your own doll bodies. If you don't want to invest in specifically made doll parts, you can use aluminum foil and then use clay to sculpt the body parts that go on the ends of the pipe cleaners. I'm going to be using some hot glue to get the legs stuck in place, and then before I attach the pre-casted hands, I'm going to be checking to see where they need to fit so that they can comfortably hold the accessories in his lap. Once I was happy with the fit, this is how it looked. I bulked up the pipe cleaner areas with cotton swabs like I did previously on the Chicken Man, and this is going to really help me when I start adding his clothes. I also wanted to add a thin layer of cotton over the aluminum foil area. This is just going to make this area softer, and it's going to make the clothes look a little bit more natural because they have room to stretch over a soft area. If it was on the aluminum foil, there might be some bumpy or pointy bits that don't look right. I'm again going to be using epoxy sculpt to create his tiny shrunken head. I cut off some of the stick before I started sculpting, and then I began working on the neck area. He is going to have a shirt that is the size of his body, so he's going to have pretty open neck area, so I need to make sure he had some sort of skin area there. Then I could start working on the head itself. This was more of a challenge than I had expected. This was such a tiny little head, and the epoxy sculpt got softer than I expected, so his head shape, as you will see, changes quite often. It's a little bit more round, then it becomes a little bit more pear-shaped, then I try to squish it to make it thinner, and it just keeps changing. To create the eyes, I found these little white beads, and I thought they were perfect for that wide-eyed stare he seems to have. I didn't even fill anything inside the beads. I think it looks okay just how they are. So I put those in place so that he had some set eye areas, and then I could continue sculpting around. I added a little strip of clay right above the eyes to make a more defined brow, and then I started sculpting that into the head that already existed. For his mouth, I decided not to put any actual strings, but instead to make it look as though there are little indentions where the strings would be. From afar, you can't really tell that there's not strings. I can always go back and add them later if I decide they're needed. I kept messing with the features of his face over and over again, and his head kept getting out of shape, and so eventually I just ripped it off, worked on it in my fingers, and then put it back on his head, and then reformed the head to the body. It was a struggle. While I had the clay out, I decided to add some heels underneath his feet because I know I'm going to be making him some big boots, and the bare feet with the uplifted heels were going to be a little bit difficult to work around. So this is going to help me down the road with his shoes. Once the epoxy sculpt was dry, I decided to paint the entire thing a zombie gray. I got really good at making a zombie flesh tone when I was making zombie nutcrackers quite a while ago. I'm going to do this over his head, the neck area, and his hands because once he's clothed, that's all you will see. After that dries, I can go around with some black chalk pastel and try to darken up the eye circles, and then go around the base of the neck and any other places that need to be a little bit darker. And this is his final look. I sprayed him with Mr. Super Clear just like I did the Chicken Man. The clothing is going to be a very similar process. I'm going to put on one pant leg at a time. I don't know what I had done with the Chicken Man's pants, but they went on a little bit smoother, or I guess I should say they looked a little bit better once they went on. And it could be a difference in fabric. The Chicken Man's fabric was very thick, and this is very thin, but as you can see there in the middle, it's not looking so good. So I folded over a piece of fabric that's going to be the center panel for the pants, and I'm going to wrap it from the front all the way around to the back, and that's going to cover up any of the rough edges from the pants material. So this is how it's looking. Not the best, but it will look a little bit better once his entire outfit is complete. Now it's time to move on to the arm tubes. We're just going to put those on either side and glue them in place like I did previously. The torso part of the shirt is basically the same vest I made for the jacket, but I turned it around backwards so that I could pull it a little bit more tight once it's put onto his body. I made sure to hem it, and then I'm going to add a t-shirt button center thing down the middle, and then he also needs 2 pockets. To make these, I folded over the edges of a piece of material to make this rectangle, and then I'm going to fold up the bottom so that 3 sides are hemmed. This is what's going to make the bulk of my pocket. I'm going to make 2 of these, one for either side of the shirt. Just going to check the size, make sure that they're correct, and I think they look okay. So I'm going to move on to making the top flap that goes over the pocket. For this, I'm just going to be gluing down one large section of fabric, and then I'm just going to cut the shape out. It's so small, it's hard to hem the edges, and so the best way to do this is to just cut it out of a glued piece of fabric. It's pretty stiff, but it works for a pocket. Now that those are done, I can glue them in place, and I have finished pockets for my shirt. To cover up the rough edges, I'm going to be adding a collar, and then that should be complete. I can add it on and start gluing around the edges, making sure that the shirt stays in place and covers up all the places I need it to. It's going to be pulled tight in the back, so it's pretty form-fitting to his very unique form. I'm using a combination of hot glue and tacky glue for this, hoping they'll work together to hold it immediately and over time. Here's how his little shirt and pants suit are looking. It's not so great in the back, but I will be figuring out how to cover that up a little bit later. From the brown faux leather I made earlier in this video, I'm going to be making him a belt. I'm using a Christmas ornament hook to make a very rough belt buckle, and to do this I'm just bending it basically into a square that will slip over the belt so that I can just add a little dab of glue on the back and it holds in place. I cut a point into one end, and then I took a sharp tool and just stabbed through the leather so that it looked like there were little belt loop holes so that you could adjust the belt. So just a little bit of detail, and again, it's something maybe no one will see, but I know it's there and it just makes me happy. With the same brown leather, I'm going to move on to making his boots. Before I start that, I'm going to take the pants and just kind of push them up the leg a little bit and scrunch them together, because he does have quite a few wrinkles in the knees, and so I want to emulate that by pushing up the pant legs. I'm starting with the shoe tongues this time, and they're pretty tall. This is going to help me gauge how tall the boots need to be. Once those are connected to the front of the feet, I can take an L-shaped piece and I'm going to wrap that around the back of the leg and the back of the foot, and I'm just going to adjust that shape until I'm happy with how it looks once it's squished onto the foot. Before gluing it on, I'm going to take that same sharp tool and I'm going to poke holes in it because I do plan to add laces to the front of these boots. In order to do that, I'm going to use one small piece of an embroidery thread. So there's 6 strands. I took one of the strands, so it was very thin, and I used a needle to go ahead and start it in the shoe. Once it's started, I can slip the foot in there, and I'm going to start gluing the back of the shoe onto the back of the leg. Once that piece had been glued on and glued down, I can start the tedious process of lacing the boots. This is going to be a very small needle going through these very small holes back and forth until I have both sides laced up. Then I can just tie them down and make sure that the sides of the boots look right to me. I am going to add a small dab of glue in either side to make sure they stay in place, but mostly they're being held together by the laces. Next, I'm going to be adding 2 small ovals to the very top of the shoes just to cover up any of the seams underneath. Those are just going to be glued on, and I'm going to push them in place. Then I added a very thick ribbon of leather around the bottom of the shoe, and I'm going to start attaching the soles of the shoes after that. This is the very same process as the Chicken Man. Those get glued on and then cut down. Then I'm just adding one more strip to go around the sole, and that is going to pretty much complete my shoe. This was a pretty fun one to create. They're not perfect, but I think they work for this character. And I can't quite be done with the clothes yet. I need to add some buttons. They need buttons on the very front of the shirt and then also on the pockets that go on either side. I think little buttons or little shines of metal really help add realism to the outfit. So this is how he is looking up close. I have one more thing to add, and that's going to be a bandana. It's kind of hard to see, and I looked at it a few times trying to figure out what exact colors it was. I decided to go with this red fabric, and I twisted the fabric and added glue on the inside, allowed that to dry, and now I'm going to slowly and carefully glue it inside of his collar. This is also what I'm going to use to cover up the mess I created on the back of his shirt. After I got it glued in, this is how it was looking, and it definitely helps cover that up, so I'm pretty happy with that. Now without further ado, it is time to give this guy his iconic hair. I really have to get this part right or else he's just not going to look like himself. I'm going to start by painting a little black area, which is going to be the base for his hair. It's going to give me a guide on where I need to put the glue. I'm starting at the very edge and I'm going to cut a little tiny bit of viscose and go a section at a time, lining it up with the edge of his hairline. This is going to take a while, but it's going to be worth it if it looks right in the end. Once that's finished and I've gone all the way around his head and also gotten it all over my arm and work area, I can start using some of my water and tacky glue mixture as the hair gel, and I'm going to take a paintbrush and just start brushing it up so that it slowly starts to meet in the center. Then I'm going to take a black thread, go around that center where it just kind of naturally meets, and tie it down and add a tiny dab of glue. Then I can cut it off, and I made sure to have it go off to one side, which is what it does in the movie. And here is his final look. I also had to make sure to set him on the couch, make sure everything was still looking good, and he is done. However, I still have to fix his little shotgun and his hat. I did find a hat in my collection. It was actually on another doll, so we won't talk about that. That doll doesn't have a hat anymore, but that's okay because it helps us moving forward with this project. This gun I've had for a while. It's not the best. Actually, the end of it is kind of bent. But I'm going to be painting over it, adding a scope, and also adding a little shoulder strap thing that I can see in the movie. To create the scope, I'm going to be using a Q-tip, and I'm going to cut it down to the size I think it needs to be, and then I'm just going to carefully wrap some paper around the edges so that it builds up and looks like there's a little extra lens on either side. I added another little bit of Q-tip on the underside so that I could mount it on top of the gun. Once it was on top, I could go ahead and paint the entire thing black. This is not going to be a perfect replica of whatever weapon he has in the movie. I don't even know what kind it is or what to call it really, but it's going to be close enough to trick the eye, I'm hoping. There was also a shoulder strap attached to it, so I'm just going to be making this out of the same brown faux leather, and I decided to attach it to one end with a little bit of copper wire. I'm just going to string this through and then wrap it around the barrel, and then I can cut it off once I add a little bit of glue to hold it in place. On the other end, I'm just going to be gluing it down with some tacky glue so that it sticks, and I don't imagine he'll actually be hoisting this onto his shoulder, so it should work out pretty well. Finally, I'm just going to brush it with the tiniest bit of silver to highlight any of those little sculpted details, and it's done. It's still so weird to me to call any of these characters cute, but for some reason I do think he turned out really cute. I love his little expression. Now that they're both complete, it's time to put them into the waiting room with the smoking man. And I just realized I made two characters that likely can't talk, like, you know, because of the and the. So, sorry, smoking man. I'm still not entirely sure of the placement for each one of these characters, but I'm starting to get an idea based off of their look and maybe which way they're facing on where they're going to sit in the waiting room. A lot of it may also come down to where the scuba diver is sitting because he has an entire shark attached to his leg. But for now, I think they're all looking pretty comfy, and of course I can't forget to add a few little handbooks in there because, you know, they all remembered to bring them except for the Maitlands, so they've got to make sure they've got their handbook for their appointment. I'm not going to be turning the lights on until every single character is in there. It doesn't seem right to turn Miss Argentina's lights on until she's actually sitting in her office. I am so happy with how this turned out. Let me know what you think, and let me know who you think the next two characters are going to be. I'm pretty excited to get started on them. That's it for today's video. In the next video, I absolutely refuse to make a suit. Really quickly, before I end the video, I want to say a big thank you to Megan for my Beetlejuice shirt. She said she did this with bleach, which I think is really cool. I don't know if you can tell from the green hue, but this is actually brown. The bleach made it brown, which you know how much I love brown, so it's perfect. Thank you, Megan. I hope you're all having a happy Beetlegust, and I will see you in the next video. Bye. Before the video officially ends, we are going to be doing one thing that I keep getting comments on my little clock up here, and it has not been running for quite a while. So I have a battery. Let's change it. For maybe the first time on this channel ever, this clock will be working. All right, new battery. It's ticking. It still works. Okay, what time is it? And here's Stormy, because I know I always get in trouble when I don't show her. But everything I'm doing right now is up on the desk. And she's short. Hey, you're short. Where are you going? You have to stay with me.